I'm not much of a hand tool guy, but I don't have to be to cash in on the popularity of them. And in this video, I'm going to talk about planing versus sanding versus scraping. And for some people, all three of these go hand in hand. You do your planing, and then you do your scraping, and then you do your sanding. Other people don't do any sanding at all. All they do is planing and scraping. That's the final finish. And who am I to argue with that kind of thing? I always like to sand. The final thing I do, and I think it's really what separates work that can be looked at as being professional with amateur, is the quality of the sanding that you do in the end before you do the finish. So let's start off with planing. What I have here is my small block plane. This is a low angle one. And what you would use this for generally is shaping the work down to being flat or level with something. You want to level up an edge with something else. So this is a good tool to use. However, if you've ever used one of these for the first time, usually, you might run along the work and it'll tear out a huge chunk of material and basically ruin what you spent hours working on. And then you say, well, how do you use this damn thing anyway? So it's important to know which way the grain runs in a piece of wood. If the grain is going downwards like this, like if you're going to plane the edge and the grain is going downwards like this, there's a better than average chance that you're going to tear out some grain if you're planing from this direction, because the plane blade will tend to dig into the wood that's going downwards and it will tear it out. Whereas if you turn it around and the grain is actually going upwards like this, then you will be less likely to tear it out. Now, problems come, of course, when the grain changes direction. You'll often have that in a piece of wood. The grain could be going upwards on this side and then hit a point where it starts going downwards again. And what I found, and I know this may sound odd, but I can feel which way the grain is going with my fingers. The wood really needs to be planed or at least scraped, because this is where your scraper comes in. A scraper is generally safer to use than a plane because it really will not dig in. So what I do is I take the piece of wood and I will clamp it in the vise so it won't move. And I will take my scraper. I have one here that I made from a saw blade a few years ago, and I've been using it ever since. And I will run that along the edge, and that will give me a surface that I can feel. It's almost like rubbing a dog's back, okay? If you rub it down towards his tail, it feels a lot smoother than rubbing it back up towards his neck. And you can feel that if you're very careful. It really doesn't take much. I suggest you try it. If you feel the slightest resistance going the other way, that means you're going against the grain. So you'll want to plane the other way. Another way of detecting which way the grain is going, to actually physically look at it. And you can see, in this case, the grain is going uphill. And that's a good indication usually. But I always like to double check to make sure that it feels like I can feel that backwards rubbing right here. When I go the other way, it's smooth. Not super, super smooth, but smoother than this way. Let's take a second here and talk about the vise that I'm using in this video. This is what I call my gear-connected twin screw vise. And aside from looking really cool and being an interesting woodworking challenge, it's also a very capable vise for all kinds of woodworking. And the benefit, of course, with this twin screw is that it will not rack. You can easily clamp small pieces wherever you want and not have it close up on the other side. And if you're interested in building one of these for yourself, there are plans available, and there's a link in the description that'll take you right there. Sometimes you're not going to be able to detect any difference, and that usually means that the grain is fairly flat, so you're not going to have any problem planing from either direction. Also, it helps if you hold the plane on an angle when you're planing through the work, and that way you're shearing it off more, like slicing it, and therefore it's less likely to dig in and peel out a big hunk. So you've got the planing done, and everything went well, you didn't destroy anything, the next step would be to use a scraper where you can, and that will flatten things even more. And what the scraper can do is it can eliminate a lot of sanding steps. However, what planing and scraping does is it leaves behind a surface that's kind of shiny, and it doesn't match anything that's sanded. So you really have to sand everything anyway. And I would start with 220, and then it depends upon what you're doing with it. You can go up to 400. I never go past 400. In fact, I rarely go past 220 for anything that I make, because after you finish sanding, you have to put on the first coat of finish. That usually raises the grain. Even with the oil-based finish, you'll have to do sanding after that. And I do all of my sanding and the finish at 400 grit.